Chapter 20 of The Tragic Bride. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Tragic Bride by Frances Brett Young. Chapter 20. Much to the disgust of Hollis, who was in the habit of making the most of his Sundays, Gabrielle left Overton by the early morning train, while Arthur slept undisturbed after his night of wonder, and Mrs. Payne rose anxiously to face the certain embarrassments and the possible bitterness of her victory. She had not slept at all, for though she never for one moment dreamed of going back on the decision which her conscience, amongst other things, had dictated, she was still in doubt as to whether she had won her son or lost him forever. She almost regretted the burst of generosity in which she had refused to read Gabrielle's letter of renunciation. For all she knew, the wording might be provocative and calculated to wreck her plans at the last moment. The letter lay sealed upon her dressing-table. It speaks well for her sense of honor in a bargain that this pathetic document remained unopened. Meanwhile she only prayed that the hours might pass and her fate be revealed. She could only rack her brains imagining some means by which the severity of the blow might be tempered for Arthur. Next morning he came down 10 minutes late for breakfast. He missed Gabrielle at once. "Where's Mrs. Considine?" he said. "I called at her door as I came down, but I don't think she's there." "No," said Mrs. Payne. "She had to go back to Lapton by the first train. An urgent call of some kind." "A telegram? The old man isn't ill, is he?" "She left a letter for you," said Mrs. Payne, handing him Gabrielle's envelope. "What a rotten shame," he said as he took it. "It's a splendid morning for a ride. I hope it's not serious." He opened the letter and read it. What Gabrielle had written Mrs. Payne never knew, for even in later years he did not tell her. She had expected a terrible and passionate outburst and prepared herself to meet it with argument and consolation, but no outburst came. She saw him go very red and then white. Then he steadied himself and said in a curious voice: "Mother, if you'll excuse me, I must go out." She put out her hand to him, but he pushed back his chair and went quickly through the French window of the dining room into the garden. She wanted to follow him, for she feared that on the impulse of the moment he might do something terrible, but controlled herself in time. She stood on the terrace, impotent, watching him as he crossed the lawn and made for the fields. It was a terrible day for her. She felt that she couldn't go to church in her usual way, but stayed at home tortured by the most hopeless and tragic anticipations of evil. At lunch-time he had not returned. It was with difficulty that she restrained herself from sending Hollis out over the hill with a search party, but the curious fatalism that had settled on her when once her decision was made compelled her to patience. It was his own battle, she reflected, and if he had wanted her help he would have come to her. Evidently he had decided to fight it out alone. She went to her own room and prayed desperately for his salvation. In the evening he returned, tired out with ceaseless wandering. He had eaten nothing all day and looked very old and haggard. She had expected a tender scene of confidence and was ready to overwhelm him with the consolations of her love. But even now he said nothing to her, and she dared not take the first step herself. From his silent misery she gathered that Gabrielle had not told him that she knew of the secret. Evidently, and very wisely, she had given him general and conventional reasons for her renunciation, treating it as a matter that concerned themselves and no one else, denying Mrs. Payne the privilege and pain of sharing in Arthur's disillusionment. Therefore his mother judged it wiser to behave as though she knew nothing of what he was suffering, though she saw by the steadiness of his demeanor that he had taken the blow squarely and come through. The fact that he didn't break down miserably, as she had expected he would, convinced her more than ever that he had become a man. She felt certain now that she had been right in following her instinct and facing the risk that her action involved. She believed that she had triumphed. Certainly the boy who faced her at the dinner table in suffering and awkward silence was very different from the Arthur of 6 months before. There was a look of determination in his eyes that made her confident. He kissed her good night without the least tremor, and she went to bed herself full of serene thankfulness. Nor did she forget how much she owed to the girl who was breaking her heart in the loneliness of Lapton. She wrote to Gabrielle that night. "I think it is all right," she said. "Heaven only knows what I owe you for your generosity, what Arthur owes you." He never mentioned Gabrielle's name to her again. Next morning, in a calm and serious mood, he approached her on the subject of his return to Lapton. "Would you mind very much," he said, "if I don't go back to Devonshire? I feel that I'm rather out of place there. You see, I'm older than the others. Do you think it could be arranged?" At first she feigned surprise. She could do nothing else. But in doing so she cleverly contrived to make it easy for him. "If you wish I will write to Dr. Considine," she said. She didn't suggest the elaborate falsehoods on which she would build her letter. "I think you are old enough to decide," she told him. "What would you like to do?" "Is there any reason why I shouldn't travel?" he said. "I feel that I want a change. I should like to see something of the world." So, without further difficulty, it was arranged. She sent him round the world with a new tutor, waiting placidly and happily at Overton for his return. It was in these days that I became acquainted with her and conceived the admiration for her that I still hold. She often spoke to me in terms of the most utter devotion of her son. I imagined her an ideal mother, as indeed she was. After a year or more abroad, Arthur returned, very much the man of the world. At his own desire he went up to Oxford, where he passed a perfectly normal 3 years and took a decent degree. In his last term he fell in love with the daughter of a neighbouring parson, whom, in due course, he married. The following year the young couple went out to New Zealand, a country to which Arthur had been attracted on his travels, and that is all that I know of him. During all this time Mrs. Payne corresponded regularly with Gabrielle. Now that Arthur's safety was beyond question, and even in the earlier debatable period, she had not the least objection to sharing him with her rival, at a distance. She even sent her his letters from abroad. In this way they arrived at a curious and altogether happy intimacy. Gabrielle's letters became a part of her life, and when, in the autumn after Arthur's engagement was announced, they suddenly stopped, Mrs. Payne felt that she had suffered a loss. She wrote 2 or 3 times to Lapton, but received no reply, and it was only by the chance meeting of a friend who had been staying in Devonshire that she learned what had happened. It came to her as a piece of idle gossip, but the shock of an extraordinary coincidence upset her for many days. It appeared that Dr. Considine, by this time a well-known figure in the county, had gone out one evening rabbit shooting with his wife. As they were returning from their expedition down one of the steep slopes above Lapton Manor, he had slipped in getting over a gate, and fallen. It was the usual type of shooting accident that no one could explain. The gun had gone off and shot him dead. "He was terribly mutilated about the head," said Mrs. Payne's informant. She did not know what had happened to his widow. Probably she had gone to her cousins, the Halbertons. In any case, the jury had completely exonerated her. Mrs. Payne flared up in Gabrielle's defense. "Exonerated!" "It was well known that they were not on the best of terms," said her visitor, discreetly. Chapter 21.